All right, so circuit riders. Circuit riders were a partial, semi-successful solution to the shortage of clergy in colonial America. Right, you know, a relatively small percentage of the colonial population, like maybe 1 out of 20 colonists, lives in towns or cities. Some of them live close enough to towns or cities to go into town for church, but like most colonists lived in rural areas outside the reach of churches, right? I mean, they might have a church building, but they didn't have a priest or minister to officiate. So circuit riders were traveling preachers. They would ride from town. They would ride around different rural areas, visiting rural villages maybe every couple years to do to knock out the backlog of funerals and marriages that needed to get done. And the circuit riders were routinely horrified because these rural folks, when when young people in rural areas fell in love and wanted to get married, they often would not wait. The 2 or 3 years they would need to wait for the circuit rider preacher to show up. Sometimes they just shack up and start having kids, and so circuit riders are horrified because they come into town and they have these people whom they regarded as living in sin, who are coming wanting to get now married after the fact. And of course, the circuit rider would do his duty and marry them so that they wouldn't have to live in sin anymore. But the general feeling in the 13 colonies, we don't know. We don't know how many people. We don't know if it's a general feeling. A lot of people felt like this was a spiritual crisis, that a problem that needed to be solved. And this is where we get the concept of revivals, right? So, circuit riders were around before the Great Awakening, right? Circuit riders were not necessarily Great Awakening revivalists. A revival is, in the Great Awakening, you do have a new species of traveling preacher, but these are revivalists, not circuit riders. And the revivalists are these dynamic preachers who come to town, and and they're not primarily serving rural areas. They're mostly going to towns and cities because that's where the crowds are. And even in towns and cities, these revivals were so big that no building could hold them all, and that's why a lot of these pictures are of preachers preaching outside, because you just have to get the preacher up on a stump, and everyone would gather around, and people, the preacher would project with a powerful voice, and everyone would get really quiet and listen. And so that's what's happening here. Sometimes preachers would come to town, and they'd be regarded as unwelcome competition by the existing priests and ministers. So sometimes they were outside, not because of the size of the crowd necessarily, but because no local church would host them. Anyhow, so what is the approach of these revivalists? How are these revivalists going to get colonists fired up about Christianity? Well, here is one of the famous Great Awakening revivalists. He was a Congregationalist minister, that is a Puritan. His name was Jonathan Edwards. Now, what's interesting about Edwards is, the Puritans were not pietists, but Edwards is. Edwards feels like Puritan churches need, a shot of energy, and so he's borrowing sort of pietist emotionalism and hoping that if he injects this into his Puritan church, and he goes on the road and tries to bring it to other Puritan churches too, and is very successful. It makes a big difference. And he sees that this is not just re-energizing the Puritan faith, but he also is trying to fight what he regards as the damaging influence of the Enlightenment and the this new deist concept, rejecting traditional Christianity. Edwards said that what people really need is to have their hearts touched by God, not their heads filled up with a whole bunch of scientific information. Because to Edwards, the emotional experience was far more necessary and useful for people. Now, his most famous sermon was called "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God," and we're going to look at an excerpt from "Sinners in the Hand of an Angry God." You don't have to write down this long quotation, but the title alone is telling you what the approach is, right? He's preaching to the congregation about how God is angry and how we are tiny little sinners in the hand of God, who we have made very angry. Edwards said, "The God that holds you over the pit of hell, much as one holds a spider or some loathsome insect over the fire, that God abhors you." Abhors means hates, right? Edwards is saying God hates you. Why? Well, God is dreadfully provoked by your sins. Your bad behavior is what has made God so angry. Your bad behavior is why God hates you. His anger, his wrath towards you burns like fire. He looks upon you as worthy of nothing else but to be cast into the fire. He is of purer eyes than to bear to have you in his sight. Right? God can't even stand to look at you because you're so disgusting. You are 10,000 times more abominable in his eyes than the most hateful, venomous serpent is in ours. Wow. Yeah, so Edwards is basically trying to scare people back into church, scare people back into Congregationalist Puritan Christianity. And this is not an approach that's attractive to many people in our times, but this was an approach that was that affected people deeply at the time. People. He would give this sermon, and people were sort of quietly crying while he was preaching. But when he finished, people just let loose. People were sobbing loudly, screaming in terror. On one occasion, he finishes the sermon and it's just chaos and noise and panic for a good 10 minutes before people calm down and he can lead them in a concluding hymn and wrap up the service. This is another Great Awakening preacher. His name was George Whitefield, and he was cross-eyed, and what was interesting is that he is drawn and painted cross-eyed. Back then, people were really hard on folks who had any kind of thing going on unusual with their appearance, and it was customary if you had scars from smallpox or something, the painter wouldn't paint that. Like George Washington had smallpox scars, but none of the artists who do his portrait draw the smallpox scars. They don't. They make him look better. That's the advantage of a painting over a photograph. I mean, they obviously didn't have access to photographic technology back then, but what's happening here is artists are accurately drawing Whitefield because they believe, in most cases, they would think that if a person were cross-eyed, that was unlucky. But in his case, he was such a great dynamic preacher, people decided it was evidence of him having been blessed by God. Now, George Whitefield had a simple explanation for why people weren't going to church much in the 13 colonies. It's because there were two aspects to the problem. One was the shortage of clergy and the shortage of opportunities to go to church. The other part of the problem was that even when churches were available, a lot of colonists weren't bothering to go to church. So that's the other aspect of the crisis of colonial Christianity. And Whitefield's explanation for that is, well, people don't want to go to church because priests are boring, ministers are boring, congregations are dead because dead men preach to them. Now, Whitefield was anything but boring, and his approach was, well, pretty much the opposite of Edwards. While Edwards was trying to terrify people into church, Whitefield was trying to welcome them. Here's an excerpt from a Representative Whitefield sermon. Open the door of your heart. Make room for Christ. The Lord Jesus desires to sup with you tonight. Jesus wants to have you over for dinner. Christ is willing to come into any of your hearts that will be pleased to open and receive him. Come, poor, lost, undone sinner, come just as you are to Christ. He will receive you with open arms. The dear Redeemer is willing to receive you all. Right, so Whitefield is the velvet glove to Jonathan Edwards' iron fist, and well, Whitefield's approach works too. It also provokes huge emotional reactions. In this case, people are weeping for joy, shouting for joy. You get huge response in both cases. This is another depiction of Whitefield here. He's gotten so carried away that he lost his wig. That's what he's holding in his left hand. And without his wig, he ends up with essentially a Princess Leia hairstyle. A man ahead of his times. I'm not sure if this is what inspired George Lucas to go with that do for Princess Leia in Star Wars: A New Hope. Anyhow, the Great Awakening, that's my abbreviation for the Great Awakening because it's a really long thing to write over and over again. Great Awakening really disrupted colonial religion. First off, it split churches, right? A lot of times revivals come to town and people are like, yep, this is the kind of religion for me. And if their existing church didn't want to adapt, then they would quit and join a church that worked that way, or create a new church that worked that way. This split in churches often had a generational dynamic to it. Older people typically were turned off by the Great Awakening revival style. Younger generations more interested in it, and so the churches often split along generational lines. Great Awakening inspired women. Most of the attendants at Great Awakening revivals were women. And some of the women believed that God was inspiring them too, and that maybe women could start speaking in public about religion too, leading revivals and so forth. Now, this was a small number of women, and the backlash was fierce. It was shut down. Like, the stars of the Great Awakening, Edwards, Whitefield, they didn't endorse women doing this. But this is an interesting blip of women who weren't normally supposed to speak in public at all, attempting to speak in public, and in some cases getting away with it briefly before they were shut down. But yeah. Now, another consequence of the Great Awakening is it helps a little bit to relieve the shortage of clergy. And this happens in a couple different ways. One way that it happens is a lot of these revivalist, pietist, Great Awakening churches have a lower bar for entry. They don't insist that clergy be highly educated. They, some of these churches believe that if, someone is truly inspired and they make sense and are interesting when they talk, then they are ergo qualified to lead a congregation, and they don't need to go to college and study, and that works, right? I mean, if you lower standards, there's going to be more candidates for preaching. Now, there is another way that the Great Awakening brings more clergy too, and we'll get to that next.